Okay, so I'm sure you came over, you saw the link and said, a mono blue aggro deck. What the hell? Okay, I was kind of surprised by it too, to be honest, but I'm on playing Arena the other night. Opponent plays this thing, and I'm like, what is this? Now, granted, the version I built's a little bit different than what they had, because I obviously didn't have their exact deck list, but I got to exploring it, and the deck's actually kind of cool. And it's the only one I've seen in the format, and I haven't seen a mono blue deck in months. Here it is. Let's get into it and take a look at it. All right, so going down the list, this is a pretty wild deck. Like, one of the things I will say it has going for it is it has a lot of stuff on the lower end, as several aggro decks do, which is going to be a bit different of an approach when your opponent's used to playing against slower blue decks. So that gives you a little bit of an advantage because early on they probably aren't going to even know what you're doing. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what I was doing when I was sitting across from it. But let's give a rundown of the cards here. You are playing Opt, which is kind of the universal, solid, easy to play turn one card. It helps shape your draws a little bit and get you down to your more powerful cards. Unsummon. This card actually is surprisingly good. It gives you some trickery when you're talking about playing against, say, mono red, when you want to bounce a Torbrand and then be able to block multiple things and gain the advantage. Like, that's one opportunity. You can also use it whenever somebody plays something like an Embercleave. They spend their mana playing it, and you could set up your blocks, let them do whatever they're going to do, and then you just bounce the creature that they're trying to equip. It also has other uses too, when you can kind of trick opponents into blocking certain ways. You can reuse a creature to get an effect out of it. So it has a few different things going on that are pretty solid for this deck. Fibblethip. It's funny because normally when you see a Fibblethip, it's really just there to draw a card, and it's kind of just holding a place in the more slow decks, I guess, if you want to call them that. But here it actually could be a fighter, and the card matters. And as we get through the deck list, you'll see that there's a couple of other uses for it being in here. Hypnotic Sprite. This is a newer card. I mean, it's not from the most recent set, obviously. It's not a Theros card. It comes from Eldraine. But it's not a card that people really play much. If you played Draft, you've probably played it a little bit. But here, it's actually pretty cool. It gives you the opportunity to counter a big thing or just play a flyer. And as you're going to see, this list has a lot of flyers. So that's one advantage it has over some of these other blue decks that you may have seen, trying to be more on the aggressive side. Thassa's Oracle. This card's actually pretty sweet too in this list. One of the biggest things about this card, believe it or not, isn't even the draws that you're shaping, though that is very huge here. It's actually a 1/3, and that is great against other aggressive decks. There are so many 2/2s and 1/1s coming out of some of these decks that a 1/3 is actually really strong. In worst case scenario, to kill it, they're going to have to spend 2 cards or an additional card at the very least, whether it's to pump the creature you're blocking or to deal an extra couple of damage to the Oracle. And that's okay. If that's the situation you end up in, great. Like, you'd rather the opponents be spending 2 and 3 cards to get rid of 1 card. Now this this card, the Threnody Singer, actually surprised me a lot. Well, one, it has flash, so that's cool. It can reduce the power of a creature significantly, which is big. There's situations where you're going to be able to use it when somebody even has like a 5 or 6 power Embercleave creature, and you take it all the way down to like a 2 power, and then they can't kill you with it, and then you can get them on the backswing. You can use it as a way to play a creature and give you better blocking situation. Like, that's a thing you can do with it. So it's a 1/3, so it's got that same thing going for it that's going to make it harder to kill by itself, and it's also reducing the power of some other creature. So a lot of times you're going to be able to use it as a removal card, oddly, and still have a creature left over, which is very, very cool. Brazen Bar, I don't know if there's really much to say about this card other than the card's just good. It's flash, it bounces things to help you keep tempo, it flies, like, except for the fact that it doesn't block ground creatures, there's really nothing wrong with this card. This list does play 2 Gadwicks, and it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. I mean, every spell in here is blue. So once you get to a situation where you have the advantage, you can keep one or two of your opponent's creatures tapped down, especially with you having a bunch of flash creatures or spells in general. Then it just kind of takes away any potential advantage they would have. And then Heraldic Banner, this is probably the weakest card in the list, but it does give some of those smaller creatures you played earlier a little more bite, and it does give you some extra mana when you want to place multiple things with something like a Gadwick on the table, or as you'll see coming up, activate a Thassa or whatnot. NATO Kraken, this is a cool home for this deck, because it's a 2/3 creature, but if it doesn't get dealt with initially, then it becomes a real problem for your opponents, because now you can gum up the ground while you're also attacking in the air. So every turn you're making an additional 1 or 2 creatures, and you have the ability to just make the Kraken itself bigger, and you're still coming at them with flyers. So the Kraken already has been showing up in some of the blue-white control lists and has been annoying, but now it's giving a different dimension to an aggressive deck, which is very cool. There's 2 Arcanus Owls. The only thing it's really good for here is either finding your Thassa or finding a Heraldic Banner when you're trying to finish the game. Otherwise, it's just a big 3/3 flyer, and it does allow Thassa to activate or come alive pretty much with just it and Thassa, which is pretty nice. And then, of course, we've mentioned it a couple of times, Thassa Deep Dwelling is super spectacular in this list. It actually does quite a few things. Other than just being a big 6/5 creature, which it often is in this list, you have a lot of things that have 2 blue pips in the cost, which is real nice. But it allows you to control the game state. People, I think, forget that Thassa has another ability that lets you just tap down a creature. And once you get ahead and you're pressuring your opponent, tapping a creature is huge. And also look at the fact that you're able to do stuff like keep bouncing in and out a Thassa's Oracle. So you can pretty much set up your draw each turn looking through 5 or 6 cards at a time. You have the ability to bounce, or I guess draw extra cards off of a Thibblethip. That's also very cool. So she has some uses in this list beyond just being a big body and a tapper, but you can get in situations where you have like her and a Gadwick, and it can be really hard for your opponent to even move the game forward at that point. The mana, I actually went with almost all blue lands and then just 3 Temple of Deceit just to kind of shape your draws a little bit. It's possible that if this comes up too quirky for you, feel free to remove the temples and just play more islands, or maybe even more Castle Vantress. Totally okay. The sideboard, we're still kind of guessing a little bit, because obviously this is a new type of deck, a new archetype. It hasn't really been tested much. So we went with a couple of Grafdigger's Cages, mostly to deal with any of the stuff trying to be played out of the graveyard, like Uros, to deal with the cat food decks, that type of thing. Essence Capture, pretty obvious. Disdainful Stroke is actually pretty good against the control decks right now. Being able to stop like Elspeth that conquers death, any of the board sweepers, that type of stuff, it's a good card for that. Aether Gust, again, it's a card against Gruul or against some of the mono red decks. Gives you a little bit of flexibility there. An additional NATO Kraken, I would play this really probably against the control decks, be another card you bring in. So it can be kind of a 1 creature thing that they have to deal with. So you can sit behind it and just build up a small army without dedicating too much to the board. Ashiok is another card to help deal with decks that are manipulating the graveyard for some reason. And finally, just a God Eternal Kefnet, which truthfully, we don't know how powerful this card's going to be in here, but it's another good card against the control decks because it just doesn't die. It keeps coming back. If you're in a weird spot, it can give you something that can block a Dream Trawler a bit, and buy you some time. So there's a few things that could go on here. But again, season to taste, so to speak, on the sideboard. We're kind of just playing different cards that are try stuff out. Now, overall, I think this deck's pretty cool. It's actually reasonably situated in the metagame right now, in the sense of it can get by a lot of what the control decks are trying to do, because you have flyers, which they don't have much in the air, believe it or not. So it makes it hard, because a lot of their defenses are making the 0/4 wall from the Meletus enchantment. And then they're also playing, I guess the land that makes the 1/1s. That's really it. They don't have much else. So you have your castle, and really just 0-4 blockers. But if you're coming through in the air, it doesn't really matter. You also have situations where you're going to get a couple of creatures out and then Thassa, and then you can just hold some creatures. So if they do sweep the board and you don't have a spell counter, you can immediately play a couple of creatures down, Thassa's live, and then just start attacking with a 6-power creature. So there's a few little tricks in here that you can really lean on to get past some of the problems that the control decks may be giving you. It also has good play against the aggro decks. I would say, if anything, it maybe suffers against the mid-rangey decks a little bit, say something like Gruul that comes through with extra tramplers and has a little bit more spot removal. That could be a little bit of a problem, so I would be concerned about that. But if you don't see a lot of that type of deck in your metagame, this is probably a really good spot. It's something different for sure, so if nothing else, you'll have a little bit of an advantage while your opponent figures out what the heck you're doing. Because even if you lead with like a Thassa's Oracle or something, it kind of looks like, oh, well, you may be playing a self-mill deck. And then a couple turns later, when you're blocking some creatures and you're playing a Gadwick, all of a sudden, your opponent's kind of made 2 or 3 strategic errors, and now you have the advantage. Not sure how long that will last, but it's a very cool way to go and something different to try out. So I hope you like the list, something different. If you like these deck techs that I'm doing, please hit the like and the subscribe button down below, because that helps out a bunch while we're trying to grow the channel. And we'll see you next time on the next deck tech we do.